Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, I'm sharing some tips with how to use crayons in adult coloring books. That's right, crayons for adults. We used to play with them a lot when we were little, and now playing with them as adults, well, it seems a little silly or foolish, but it's really a very fun process. If you can get past the stigma of using children's tools, you can have a great time. Now, coloring on coloring books, well, it's just like it was when you were a little kid. It's a very simple process. But if you want to take it to the next level, make it a little more refined, be sure to follow some of my tips. So let's get started. So coloring books come in all sorts of assortments and varieties, and some are geared towards adults, which means that might be a little more complex than what you'd get for a young child. But if you like coloring on a child's coloring book, go right ahead. One thing to note when you're looking at coloring books to purchase is some are geared towards colored pencils. So the images might be a little more fine-tuned, a little more detail. They can be done with crayon, but if this is something that you find that drives you nuts, keep that in mind that some of them are really geared towards colored pencils instead of crayon. So they can be done either way. That's just something that you might choose or ignore if you don't like that version. I prefer the large print coloring books. I love to have these giant images that I can shade and just play with. Something like this with the bells, I just think is so beautiful, and it lets me work on different shades, color blends, and just highlights. Same thing with this. This is a little more detailed, but it was just fun to create something from a large sketch. And the same thing here with the lighthouse. So you can find these bold and easy, the large print coloring books for adults. At some of the inexpensive stores, the dollar stores and whatnot, you can find these for just a couple bucks or less. They have all different ones. This is one with patterns. I colored this pattern. It was fun. There are some patterns that are kind of mesmerizing, hypnotic even, and all different ones, everywhere in between. So this is a fun book. These are printed on both sides. This is quite intricate, but then there are some that are mandalas and some birds here, which I just really enjoyed. And again, these are printed on both sides. The paper is a little lighter weight, less quality. You can see through the image on the back, so that's why they're cheaper. But it doesn't stop you from enjoying creating it. You can also photocopy it if you want just to have that image without anything on the back. So that's an option as well. Now here's an adult coloring book that's just lovely. It's really designed for adults to enjoy. It costs about $10. The backs are black, so you could even take them out and frame them. I guess some people might do that. And you can just play around and color it. It just seems like a little bit of an artwork. These are images that I've colored in, just because I enjoy that process. Since the drawing is already created, it's just about filling in the details and playing around with however I want, if I want to make it realistic or not. And these are how the images look before they're colored in. They're just a black and white drawing with a little bit of shading. So it's really quite fun. You can also find coloring pages that you can download on the internet. And most of them are free, but you can purchase some as well. So I found this castle one, which I thought was really interesting. And I played around with the colors, making different versions. Now, when you start coloring, there are some tips. Decide what surface you like to color on. I like to color on my desk here. It's nice and smooth. But if you prefer, put a book underneath, a notepad even. But some people like to color on a book. It has a little bit of give, and that's something quite enjoyable as well. It's all about the feel for you. You can use a clipboard just as easily. When you're going to create your piece, choose your colors and just set them aside. Crayon boxes are very inexpensive, and I tend to keep them in a plastic container. I have my neutrals sorted, and then I have my other colors here. And I don't want to keep digging through the colors, so I'll choose a color scheme for this castle. So one tip is to set your colors aside. Just keep them out, and I'll go back to them. If there's additional colors that I want, then I'll dig through my stash. but it's nice to be able to have all your colors at the ready that you think you'll use. Another tip that I find helpful is to create a color palette. I'll just take a little scrap of paper. This is just an index card cut in half, and I'll just test out the colors. I can vaguely tell that these are oranges and reds, but like for this color it's called salmon, but I wasn't quite sure what it looked like. So I just keep this color palette here. The same thing, the wild strawberry versus the red. You can see that one has a little more blue in it, one's a little cooler. So that's really helpful to figure that out. So that's my second tip. And that's what you saw when I was thumbing through my work that I've already colored. I have some little color swatches that I keep with it. This way I can test the color up against it to see if I want to go back and add color or try and match the color. I can write on this little paper instead of on my picture. The next thing when starting out is to vary your pressure. There's different ways you can do that. If I'm going to color the castle in pinks, I have all my pinks here. I'll make my little color swatch so I know which one I want to start with, the lightest one, which is this one. That brings me to my next tip. I like to work with a sharp point. So I'll peel down that crayon and then I'll use my sharpener. Now, many crayon boxes have sharpeners. I like to have a little additional sharpener besides. And I just sharpen my crayon and I keep it handy here. So when I'm coloring, I'll decide which pressure I want to use. There's no wrong answer here. Some people like to color light with light pressure and then just layer over it, and that's very effective. So I'll just color here, just making little lines, little strokes. And as you can see, the crayon breaks. That's just the characteristic of the crayon. Set that aside, because I don't like to have that in my work. If I smudge it, I'll get the crayon elsewhere. And now I'll come in with a different color. Maybe I'll take that salmon. And if I'm not sure if this is the salmon, I'll just make that mark and I can see that that's right there. And I'll decide where I want my shadow, my darker colors. I'm going to have the shadow falling on this side. So I'm starting to add a little more layers of color. And because it's crayon, I'm coloring on wax, so I have to add a little more pressure. I might even add a little bit of darkness here, the darker color, just to give a little shadow. And then lastly, I'll come in with the red, the darkest color, just to really emphasize that shadow. Now I could color the entire piece this way by blending in layers. There's another artist that showed her technique, and I'll link her video below. Her technique for using crayons is pretty stunning. She'll take her crayon and press down really hard. And again, she can use a variation of color. She doesn't have to use just one color. So I'll do that on this piece. I'll use two colors. I'll start with my lightest color, and she presses down very hard. So I want to really color that left-hand side with that light color, and I'm pressing very hard. And then I'll take my darker color, my salmon, and press down very hard on the other side. And again, I'm using much more color than I did on this piece. Then I'll take my red. The red might not show up because it's on the top layer, but I'll still add that color just for some contrast. And now what she does is she takes a scraper. I'm using just this little nylon scraper because I don't want to rip the paper. And she just presses and scrapes that color off everywhere that she put it. But it's a different effect. It takes away a lot of the waxiness that remains here. You can try and cover over it again, but whatever color you place down first, that's what stained the paper, and that's what will remain. So if I do this a second time, take my scraper, I just want to make sure it's clean, and I scrape up, I get a little bit more of the color, but not a lot. And then I make sure to clean my scraper in between, and I'll clean off my paper. Now there's another technique as well that you can use. It doesn't involve scraping. You can still layer it if you want. We'll try that on this little castle here. I'm going to take my lighter color, and instead of going to the end, I'm just going to start a little far back. And I'll just continue layering just as I did before. Now I'll clean off any of the smudges. I'm just wiping them into a trash can off camera. And then I take some baby oil. I poured it into a little dish here, and I'm using a cotton swab, and I'm going to blend it out. I like this cotton swab because it's kind of pointed, and I use just a little baby oil, not very much, and I can just blend that color, and it gives a little softness to the crayon. It actually kind of melts the crayon. Now, if I'm not careful, I can smudge that color elsewhere, right off the page. So this is a technique that you have to use very little oil, and you have to decide if you don't mind having the oil on your paper. I like this technique, I just don't use it very often. It's pretty good with a stronger paper, a watercolor paper, or a mixed media paper, or even Bristol board. But again, you want to be careful with how much oil you put on your paper. You can go back over this and add a little more color. And then here I have a dry swab and just blend it. There's still some oil on the paper, so it still blends, but you get a really smooth effect. So that's something else to consider. The last thing to note with coloring books with crayons for adults is that it's an enjoyable process. If you don't find it enjoyable, maybe it's not right for you. But if you do find it enjoyable, take your time. Figure out what you like about it. Find the images that you like to color and stick with it. Crayons are inexpensive, they're no stress, they can be found anywhere, and if they break or if you use it all up, it's very easy to replace. You can find coloring books easily, or you can draw your own images. It's an easy to do activity, and there are lots of options. For any kind of coloring book you can imagine, you can pretty much find. So those are some tips that I hope you find helpful if you want to color in coloring books with crayons as an adult, taking it a little more seriously than you did as a child, but hopefully finding that same enjoyment. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. And be sure to check out my other videos using crayons on fabric. I have a whole series. Thanks for joining me today.